I made this apron as a gift for a friend, and I thought I'd do a tutorial on how I put this thing together. I'm using Selvedge denim, and I started out with a piece about 40 inches long, and then for the straps I got some 1.5 inch wide cotton twill tape. The first thing I did was press the denim in half, selvage to selvage, and then I could start drawing out the actual pattern. I knew I wanted the bib to be about 12 inches wide finished, so I'm just putting in some marks at 6.5 inches to account for the seam allowance. And then I could go ahead and connect those marks. I want a slightly wider fold at the top of the bib, about 1.5 inches finished, so I'm just marking down 2 inches. You can see I actually messed up the first time I drew it and forgot to accommodate for that extra fold. And then I can go ahead and mark down 12 inches. That's how long I want the bib to be. And then I can just square it out to the side seam and freehand a curve to connect those two lines. And then I can go ahead and cut that piece out, and that'll be the shape of the finished apron. I decided I want some pockets on this thing, so I just used the scraps that I had cut off to cut some pockets out. Starting the actual construction, I'm just turning in and pressing the seam allowance on the side of the bib to 1/4 inch and pressing it. And then I can go ahead and turn it and press it again to finish off the raw edges. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the hem, turning and pressing at 1/4 inch. And then turning and pressing that again to finish off the raw edges. And then the last thing before I get to sewing is turning and pressing in the top edge of the pocket. Now I use the selvage here, so I only had to turn it once. And then I can just stitch down the hem around the bib and the hem at the bottom. I also went ahead and finished the top edge of the pocket. Now I did 2 lines of top stitching here to mimic the look of a double needle machine. And then back to the ironing board, where I turned in and pressed the seam allowance on the sides of all the pockets. And then at the top of the bib, I turned and pressed 1/2 inch. And then I could go ahead and turn that whole thing at 1.5 inches and press it. And then it was back to the sewing machine, where I could stitch the top edge of the bib down and top stitch on my pockets. Again, I'm doing 2 lines of top stitching to mimic the look of a double needle machine. On the breast pocket, I decided to do an additional line of stitching to hold a marker or tweezers or a tasting spoon. I decided to make the waist ties about 52 inches long, including seam allowance, and the neck strap about 27 inches long, including seam allowance. And then it was back to the ironing board. On both ends of the neck strap, I turned under and pressed 1/2 inch. And then on the waist ties, on one end, I turned and pressed under 1/2 inch, and the other end, I double turned and pressed 1/4 inch to finish off the raw edges. To actually attach the neck strap and the waist ties to the apron, I stitched all the way around the edge of the tape to form a box, starting on the inner corner where I wanted this diagonal line of stitching, which provides additional reinforcement. And then the last step was to hem the edges of the waist ties, and this apron was all finished. Let me know if you have any questions.